Maria Santos had been working at Rosie's Diner for 7 years, 7 long years of early morning shifts that started at 5 a.m. before the sun had a chance to paint the sky. She would clock in, tie her apron, the same worn fabric with coffee stains that refused to fade no matter how many times she washed it, and begin the monotonous ritual of refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and clearing plates. The diner was a perpetual symphony of sizzling bacon, clattering dishes, and the low murmur of regular customers discussing their own small lives. By the time her shift ended at 2 p.m., her feet ached, her lower back throbbed, and she felt as though she'd been squeezed dry of every ounce of energy. The pay was meager, $7.25 an hour, plus whatever tips she could coax from patrons who barely noticed her existence. Most days, those tips amounted to loose change and occasional crumpled bills. On good days, she might make $60 in tips. On bad days, barely $20. She'd learned not to depend on the kindness of strangers. Life had taught her that lesson long ago. Her husband, James, worked at the Millbrook Warehouse Distribution Center, a massive corrugated metal building on the outskirts of town that processed and shipped goods for various retailers. He'd been there for 5 years, working in the loading dock, moving boxes, organizing shipments. The work was physically demanding. His back bore the same aches hers did, though his came from lifting instead of standing. He earned slightly more than Maria, $8.50 an hour, but the job offered no benefits until after 5 years of employment. They'd just crossed that threshold 3 months ago, and now they had basic health insurance, though the co-pays were still astronomical for people like them. Together, Maria and James earned approximately $28,000 a year before taxes. After taxes, Social Security, and Medicare deductions, their annual take-home was closer to $22,000. They lived in a studio apartment in the Riverside Towers, a government-subsidized housing complex on the eastern side of Millbrook. The apartment was small, a combined living-sleeping area barely 300 square feet, a kitchen you could cross in 4 steps, and a bathroom with a shower that never quite got hot enough. The rent was $650 a month, subsidized down from what it would have been on the open market. Even so, it consumed nearly 40% of their monthly income. Groceries, utilities, transportation, insurance, and the occasional medical expense consumed the rest. Maria had learned to cook rice and beans 50 different ways. They bought store-brand everything. They shopped at thrift stores and discount outlets. They'd never been on a vacation, never eaten at a restaurant together, never owned a car. They relied on the public bus system to get around. Entertainment consisted of free movies at the library, walks through the park, and television shows they could access through basic cable. People often asked them why they didn't just work harder, get better jobs, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. These questions, whether asked with genuine curiosity or subtle judgment, always stung. The truth was far more complex. Maria had dropped out of high school to care for her younger siblings after her mother suffered a stroke. She'd eventually earned her GED through night classes while working full-time, but she'd never had the opportunity to pursue college. James had finished high school but came from a chaotic home. His father was absent, his mother worked 3 jobs and had little time for parenting. College wasn't even a possibility he'd seriously considered. His parents had no experience with higher education, no guidance to offer. Neither of them had connections, neither had family money, neither had been born into networks of opportunity. They'd applied for better jobs hundreds of times over the years, but without degrees, without experience in white-collar fields, without anyone to recommend them. The doors remained firmly closed. They weren't lazy, they weren't stupid. They were just ordinary people caught in a system that made it extraordinarily difficult to move upward. But they had something else. They had each other, and they had a stubborn refusal to accept their circumstances as permanent. James and Maria had met at a community college where they'd both been taking classes at night after work. Maria taking accounting courses, James studying business management. They hadn't been able to afford to complete their degrees, but they'd found each other, and they'd found hope in that connection. They'd married quietly at City Hall on a Tuesday during their lunch breaks, without ceremony or celebration, and they'd moved into the studio apartment together 5 years ago. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the worn futon they'd found on Craigslist and talk about their dreams. What would it be like to own something? To have a space that was truly theirs, that they could paint any color they wanted, that wouldn't require landlord approval? What would it be like to build equity instead of lining a landlord's pockets? The questions seemed almost obscene in their impossibility. With their credit destroyed by student loans, they couldn't complete and unexpected medical emergencies. They would never qualify for a mortgage. Banks laughed at applications from people like them. Yet somehow they saved. It was disciplined, almost religious in its devotion. Every tax refund went into a savings account they called the Dream Fund. Whenever Maria found a bill she'd missed logging, perhaps she'd been given a $20 for helping a customer move a heavy object, or she'd found $5 on the floor, that went into the Dream Fund too. James did the same with any extra he earned. They set up automatic transfers of $50 every 2 weeks to the savings account, money they'd carved from their already thin budget by skipping lunches or walking instead of taking the bus. 3 years of this discipline had accumulated $3,147 in the Dream Fund. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was proof that they could delay gratification, could work toward a goal, could imagine a future different from their present. It was on a Tuesday in February, during her lunch break at the diner, that Maria discovered the listing on her phone. She was sitting in the cramped staff break room, eating a peanut butter sandwich she'd brought from home while scrolling through real estate websites on her ancient smartphone. She wasn't even sure why she was looking. A kind of masochistic torture, really. Browsing houses that might as well be on the moon for all the chance they had of ever owning one. But then the title caught her eye. Historic church available. $1 purchase required. She'd read it 3 times, thinking it was a trick, a typo, some kind of scam. But as she clicked through to the full listing, the details were surprisingly straightforward. The property was the First Presbyterian Church of Millbrook, built in 1887. It was a Victorian Gothic revival structure, approximately 8,500 square feet, sitting on 2.3 acres of land. The building was currently abandoned and had been since 2010. The local archdiocese was the owner and had decided to divest itself of the property to avoid ongoing maintenance costs and potential liability issues. They were offering it for $1, yes, $1, to anyone willing to commit to its restoration and preservation. The catch was substantial. The purchaser had 7 years to complete appropriate restoration and preservation work. If they didn't meet this requirement, the church would revert to the archdiocese's ownership. It was a creative solution to an old problem. The church didn't want to simply demolish a historic building, but they couldn't afford to maintain it either. They were essentially passing the burden to someone else, betting that someone out there loved old buildings enough to make this work. Maria's hands were shaking as she took a photo of the listing with her phone and forwarded it to James. She didn't write anything, just sent the link with 3 question marks. His response came 20 minutes later. "You have got to be kidding me." They met for lunch as soon as they could, both taking abbreviated breaks and meeting at a nearby park. James had printed out the full listing and read it with the focused attention of someone studying legal documents. He read it aloud, as if hearing the words spoken would make them feel more real. He searched online for similar properties, for stories of churches being sold for nominal amounts. They found articles, blog posts, success stories, and cautionary tales. Some people had successfully restored churches. Others had bitten off more than they could chew and lost their investments. "We could call," Maria said quietly, "just to ask questions. It doesn't hurt to ask." That evening from their apartment, James made the call. He was transferred 3 times before reaching Father Dominic, the Archdiocese's property manager. Father Dominic was surprisingly warm and encouraging. Yes, the offer was genuine. Yes, they could purchase the church. Did they have any experience with historic preservation? No. Well, many successful renovators didn't start with experience. What was required was commitment, passion, and the willingness to learn. The Archdiocese would provide all available historical documentation about the church's construction and previous renovations. They would also connect qualified buyers with resources, grants, and potential tax incentives for historic preservation work. By the end of the call, James and Maria had scheduled a site visit for the following Saturday. The church was stunning, even in its state of disrepair. Standing at the iron gates, Maria felt something catch in her chest. The structure was built of grey stone blocks, with a bell tower rising majestically at the front. Gothic arches framed tall, narrow windows, most of them broken or boarded up now. The roof had multiple obvious leaks, with water stains cascading down the exterior walls. Vines had begun to climb the structure, looking for cracks and crevices. But despite the decay, despite the abandonment, the building retained an undeniable beauty. You could see what it had been. You could imagine what it could be again. They walked the perimeter slowly, peering through gaps in the boarded windows, noting damage, assessing the scope of work. Behind the main church structure was a smaller attached building, the old rectory, where priests had once lived. It was in slightly better condition, though it too showed signs of age and neglect. A professional inspector was arranged. The inspection revealed what they'd already suspected. Extensive work was needed. The roof needed replacement in multiple sections. The electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous. The plumbing was corroded. Windows needed restoration or replacement. The interior pews and fixtures would need professional cleaning. The stone exterior would need pointing and repair. The estimate for complete restoration was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, money they could never hope to raise. But the inspector also noted that the bones were good. The foundation was solid. The stone walls were structurally sound. The building had been well constructed in the first place, built to last. It wasn't a lost cause. It was a challenge, certainly, but not an impossible one. The paperwork took 3 months. Title searches, property surveys, environmental assessments, extensive meetings with Archdiocese officials. There were agreements to sign, conditions to verify, lawyers to consult. Maria and James had to put down their $1 purchase price, though they also had to pay for the inspection, the title search, and legal fees. These costs ate through their dream fund. By the time the purchase was finalized in May, they had roughly $1,000 left in their savings. The day they received the deed in the mail, they stood outside the church for an hour, just holding the paper and not speaking. Finally, they had something. They had a piece of the world that belonged to them. The first 2 years were brutal. Maria and James worked their regular jobs during the day, then spent evenings and weekends on the church. They watched YouTube videos on masonry, roofing, and carpentry. They joined online communities of historic preservationists. They frequented the library, checking out books on restoration techniques and historical architecture. Maria took a night class in basic construction management at the community college. James befriended an elderly contractor named Tom, who came to volunteer one Saturday. Tom returned every Saturday after that, teaching James proper techniques for pointing stone and repairing mortar joints. They couldn't afford to hire professionals for most of the work. Instead, they did what they could themselves, hiring contractors only for the most dangerous or technically specialized work. They replaced broken windows using salvaged pieces from salvage yards, spending weeks researching which windows matched the original architectural style. They patched the roof with materials they could afford, creating a temporary solution while they saved for a permanent one. They scraped, cleaned and repaired stone blocks. They stabilized walls that were beginning to shift. It was exhausting work, often frustrating and sometimes dangerous. Maria fell off a ladder once and fractured her wrist. James cut his hand deeply on rusted metal and had to get stitches. They fought frequently about priorities, about money, about the overwhelming scope of the project. There were nights when one or both of them wept from sheer fatigue and doubt. They questioned whether they'd made a terrible mistake, whether they should just sell the church and recoup whatever losses they could. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the church began to transform. The most dangerous structural issues were addressed. The exterior was cleaned, the roof was stabilized, windows were restored. The interior was cleared of debris and excess moisture managed. They weren't rich yet. They were spending every spare dollar on materials, but they were making progress. By the start of the third year, they could move into the rectory. It wasn't comfortable by most standards. They had a bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area, and a bathroom. The heating worked, though barely. The plumbing was temperamental, but it was theirs, and it was indisputably better than the studio apartment. More importantly, it meant they could be at the church whenever they needed to be, could supervise work, could continue with repairs at their own pace. Local news picked up the story. "Poor couple restores historic church with dream and determination," read one headline. "From abandoned to cherished, one couple's labor of love," read another. Suddenly, they were known in the community not as anonymous poor people, but as the inspiring couple restoring the church. People's attitudes toward them shifted. Neighbors who'd barely acknowledged them now stopped to ask about progress. Local business owners donated materials. A hardware store owner gave them a discount on supplies. A roofing company donated scrap material they could use. The volunteer work increased as people wanted to be part of their story. It was during the third year, on a cool October evening, that James made his discovery. He'd been exploring the interior more thoroughly now that the immediate safety issues had been addressed. He was interested in the altar area, planning to document it thoroughly before beginning restoration work there. The altar was a substantial stone structure, approximately 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, with a raised platform at the back and decorative carvings along the sides. What struck him as unusual was the base. It seemed disproportionately thick compared to what was necessary for support. He'd mentioned it to Maria that evening, but she was focused on the deteriorating roof in the baptistry. Water was actively dripping into the chamber, and she wanted to at least contain the damage before winter set in. James's observation about the altar seemed less pressing. It was filed away in his mind, noted but not urgent. But James couldn't quite let it go. Over the following weeks he examined it more closely. There was a seam, barely visible, that suggested the stone base might consist of multiple pieces rather than being a single carved block. The line ran horizontally, about 2 feet from the ground. He ran his fingers along it repeatedly, feeling the slight indentation. He photographed it from various angles. It was subtle enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were specifically looking for it, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. He mentioned it again to Maria, and this time she listened more carefully. Together they examined it. They cleared away the decorative cloth that hung from the altar and inspected the base thoroughly. The seam was definitely there, and looking more carefully, examining the stone's color and texture, they could see that the lower portion of the altar base had a slightly different appearance than the rest. It was actually a distinct piece of stone, fitted almost seamlessly to the base above it. Why would they do that? Maria wondered aloud. Why would you construct an altar base in sections like this? Maybe it was repair work, James suggested. Maybe the original was damaged and they replaced the bottom section. Maybe, Maria agreed, but she didn't sound convinced. When Dr. Richard Carmichael visited the church in late November, he'd reached out after seeing an article about their restoration work and offered to tour the building. James once again brought up the anomaly. Dr. Carmichael was a history professor at the State University, specializing in early American religious architecture and ecclesiastical history. He had the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in academia, wire-rimmed glasses, salt and pepper hair, the kind of slow, deliberate manner of someone accustomed to careful analysis and deep thinking. They were giving him the full tour, showing him their restoration work with the mixture of pride and anxiety that came with sharing something you cared deeply about with an expert who might find fault. Dr. Carmichael was attentive and enthusiastic, asking detailed questions about construction methods, architectural decisions, and the building's documented history. As they stood before the altar, James almost didn't mention the seam. It had begun to feel slightly paranoid, like he was reading significance into something that was probably perfectly ordinary. But something about the professor's genuinely engaged demeanor made him decide to share his observation. Dr. Carmichael's reaction was immediate and intense. His eyes widened behind his glasses. He crouched down, running his fingers along the seam, producing a small LED flashlight from his pocket to examine the line more closely. "This shouldn't be here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This absolutely shouldn't be here." He stood up slowly, turning to face them. "Do you know anything about the church's history? Who was the architect? Who designed this altar specifically?" Maria and James shook their heads. The Archdiocese had provided some historical documents, but they focused on maintenance records and utility information rather than the building's original construction and purpose. "I need to research this," Dr. Carmichael said. "May I come back? May I bring some of my colleagues?" Within a week, the church had become the center of an academic investigation. Dr. Carmichael returned with colleagues, an archaeologist, a structural engineer, and another historian. They brought equipment, ground-penetrating radar, digital imaging cameras, measurement tools. They worked methodically and carefully, documenting everything. The ground-penetrating radar confirmed what their physical examination suggested. Beneath the sealed stone was a hollow chamber. Within that chamber were shapes that resembled objects, rectangular forms, stacked together. The discovery electrified the team. This was significant. This was historical. The decision to open the chamber couldn't be made quickly. Dr. Carmichael contacted the Archdiocese. A lawyer was consulted who actually owned the contents of the chamber now that the church had been sold to Maria and James. After weeks of negotiation and paperwork, an agreement was reached. The chamber would be opened under professional supervision. The contents would be documented and evaluated. Maria and James would retain ownership of the church and its contents, but would agree to work with the Archdiocese and academic researchers to preserve and study whatever was discovered. On a grey December morning, with cameras recording and protocols being followed with meticulous precision, the stone block was carefully removed from the altar base. The work took 8 hours. The stone was heavy, ancient, and had to be handled with extreme care to avoid damage, but finally it was set aside, revealing the hollow chamber beneath. The boxes inside were beyond anyone's expectations. 5 wooden boxes, their surfaces darkened by more than a century of isolation, were carefully extracted. They were sealed with lead solder and wrapped in cloth that crumbled to dust at the gentlest touch. Photographs documented every stage of the removal. Then the boxes were transported with extreme care to the university's climate-controlled conservation laboratory. Over the following weeks, the boxes were opened one by one. The process was slow and painstaking. Each box had to be carefully photographed before opening. The contents had to be assessed for stability. Professional conservators worked to preserve fragile documents and materials, and as the contents were revealed, a story of extraordinary historical significance began to emerge. The first box contained letters, hundreds of them, or rather one massive bound volume containing transcriptions and copies of hundreds of letters. They were written in a careful, elaborate script, and they were dated beginning in 1890. The ink had faded, but remained legible. The letters were written in multiple languages, English, Latin, German, and Italian, and they bore signatures, official seals, and postmarks from locations across the United States. Dr. Carmichael began the painstaking work of translation and analysis. Maria and James were invited to the university to witness some of the opening and to hear Dr. Carmichael's preliminary findings. What he'd discovered was extraordinary. The church had been at the center of an underground network. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the church's priest, Father Matthias Hollister, who had served the parish from 1886 until his death in 1924, had been running a secret operation. He was part of a nationwide network of clergy members, politicians, and businessmen who were helping Italian immigrants escape exploitation by labor traffickers and organized crime syndicates. The immigration period had been brutal for Italians arriving in America. Many came with nothing, vulnerable to predatory practices. Labor traffickers would promise jobs and housing, then force immigrants into servitude, sometimes for years, paying them nothing while charging inflated prices for room and board. Organized crime organizations controlled neighborhoods and squeezed immigrants for protection money. Women and girls were particularly vulnerable to trafficking and sexual exploitation. Father Hollister, a man of deep principle and faith, had decided to intervene. The letters documented his efforts. Immigrants who arrived at his church, desperate and frightened, many speaking little English, having been separated from their families, or fleeing dangerous situations, Father Hollister would provide them shelter, food, and clothing. He would help them learn English. He would connect them with legitimate employers. He would forge documents when necessary, technically illegal, but done to help people escape genuine danger and exploitation. More remarkably, he'd maintained meticulous records. The letters in the first box were correspondence between Father Hollister and other clergy members, documenting the people he'd helped. He would write to a priest in Chicago, saying something like, "I am sending you, the Rossi family, 3 adults and 2 children. Giuseppe has carpentry skills and should do well in construction work. Please help them settle and ensure they are not exploited. I will check on their progress." The second box contained photographs, formal portraits from that era, families posed in front of the church, individuals in work clothes, groups of immigrants who'd just arrived. On the back of many photos were names written in careful script, along with dates and notations. The Volkov family arrived July 1903, sent to Boston, settled in shoe manufacturing business. Antonio Maggio and wife Rosa arrived 1901, placed with railroad, later purchased small farm. Maria Benedetti arrived 1905 as domestic worker, now manages household of judge. The third box held official documents, employment records, letters of recommendation written in Father Hollister's careful hand, permits, certificates. It was a paper trail documenting the placement of hundreds of people. There were records of wages paid, confirmation of safe employment, notes about how people had rebuilt their lives. The fourth box was smaller and contained something unexpected, a personal journal written entirely in Latin, Father Hollister's private reflections on his work. He wrestled with profound questions about faith, morality, duty, and the meaning of compassion. He documented his doubts, his fears, and his firm conviction that he was doing God's work. There were passages of extraordinary beauty, reflections on witnessing the transformation of terrified, hopeless people into confident, established members of their communities. He wrote about the moral weight of his decisions, the risks he took, and his absolute certainty that helping the vulnerable was worth any personal cost. The fifth box held a small wooden icon painted in the Eastern Orthodox style, depicting various saints. On the back was a note written in careful script, "To Father Matthias Hollister, with eternal gratitude from the Volkov family, 1923. The discovery made international headlines. The New York Times ran a feature article. Academic journals began publishing analyses of the documents. Documentary filmmakers reached out to Maria and James, asking to tell their story. The poor couple who'd accidentally preserved a hidden history. Universities across the country began requesting access to the documents. Father Hollister, who had been entirely forgotten by mainstream history, suddenly became recognized as a significant historical figure, a precursor to modern immigrant advocacy, a quiet hero of the Gilded Age. The impact was multifaceted and profound. Dr. Carmichael and his team worked with genealogists to trace the descendants of people mentioned in the documents and photographs. Many of the families Father Hollister had helped had thrived. They'd gone on to successful lives. Their descendants now included lawyers, teachers, entrepreneurs, artists, academics. Some had remained in Millbrook, their family histories deeply intertwined with the town. Others had spread across America, establishing successful businesses and contributing to their communities. Reunions were organized. Descendants of the families Father Hollister had helped came to visit the church. Many wept, standing before the altar, understanding for the first time the significance of their family histories. They learned about the priest who'd risked so much for their grandparents and great-grandparents. They expressed gratitude to someone they'd never known, but whose compassion had literally changed the trajectory of their family's existence. The Archdiocese, moved by the discovery and by the public response, made a significant decision. Rather than simply shelving the documents, they committed to preserving and publicly sharing them. The church was reclassified not just as a historic building requiring preservation, but as a site of pilgrimage and education, a place where people could come to learn about immigration history, about faith-based social justice, and about the quiet heroism of people who choose compassion over indifference. A museum was created in the lower level of the church, a beautiful, respectful space where the documents, photographs, and artifacts could be displayed in climate-controlled, carefully curated exhibits. Interactive displays explained the context of immigration during the Gilded Age. Videos featured descendants telling stories about their ancestors. A scholarly resource section provided access to digitized versions of all the documents for researchers and historians. The museum opened to the public with a formal dedication ceremony attended by descendants, historians, church officials, and community members. The church began offering regular lectures and educational programs. Universities began bringing students to study the documents. High school history classes visited to learn about immigration and social justice. The church, once abandoned and forgotten, became a thriving center of learning and reflection. For Maria and James, the discovery transformed their lives in ways they could barely comprehend. The story of the poor couple who'd bought a church for $1 and had accidentally preserved a treasure resonated deeply with people. Donations began arriving. Not charity given with pity, but contributions offered with genuine enthusiasm and respect. A construction company donated professional labor for the remaining restoration work. An anonymous benefactor provided significant funding to install proper climate control and security systems in the sanctuary to protect the historical materials. A preservation foundation granted them funding specifically designated for exterior restoration. What had seemed like an impossible 7-year restoration project began to accelerate dramatically. More importantly, Maria and James found themselves no longer trapped in poverty. Maria had been hired as the associate director of the Church Museum, working part-time to coordinate educational programs and manage volunteer docents. James had been trained in professional conservation techniques and was now the director of the church's restoration operations, coordinating with contractors and specialists. Both positions paid better than their previous jobs, not lavishly, but enough to allow them to live with dignity and security. They moved out of the cramped rectory and into a comfortable house 3 blocks away that they'd been able to purchase with a first-time homebuyer's loan and help from the church community. More than the financial improvements, though, was the psychological transformation. They were no longer invisible. They were no longer seen as failures or drains on society. They were recognized as caretakers of something significant, as people whose vision and determination had preserved an important piece of American history. When they walked through town, people greeted them with warmth and respect. Their story was cited in economics textbooks and inspirational literature. They were invited to speak at colleges and community organizations about their experience. 5 years after the discovery, the church was fully restored. The sanctuary gleamed with renewed life. The stone exterior had been carefully cleaned and stabilized. The roof had been completely replaced with materials that matched the original specifications. The windows had been restored to brilliance, their glass bright and clear, casting colored light onto polished wooden pews. The interior had been thoughtfully renovated to accommodate its new role as both a sacred space and a museum, with the sanctuary used for quiet reflection and special ceremonies, while the lower level held the museum exhibits. The restoration had cost approximately $800,000, money that came from grants, donations, government tax incentives for historic preservation, and years of Maria and James's own labor and sacrifice. The church that they'd purchased for $1 had been restored to its former glory and given a new purpose that honored its history while serving contemporary needs. On the 10th anniversary of their purchase, the church held a major celebration. Hundreds of people attended: historians, descendants of the families Father Hollister had helped, community members, church officials, and journalists. The event was held on a sunny June afternoon in the restored sanctuary. Descendants stood and shared stories about what Father Hollister's intervention had meant for their families. Historians discussed the significance of his work. Museum visitors spoke about what they'd learned from the exhibits. Dr. Carmichael stood at a podium, positioned in front of the altar, and spoke about the power of small acts of kindness echoing across generations. He spoke about the courage required to help the vulnerable when doing so came with personal risk. He spoke about compassion as a form of courage, and he spoke about Maria and James, the poor couple who'd started with nothing but $1 and a dream, who had transformed an abandoned building into a sanctuary for history and meaning. Maria and James sat together in the front pew, holding hands. They thought of the day they'd first stood outside the iron gates with a single key and a deed, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task before them. They remembered the doubt, the exhaustion, the financial desperation, the nights when they'd questioned whether they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They thought of Father Hollister, laboring in secret over a century ago, never knowing that his compassion would be rediscovered and honored by descendants and scholars, that his work would touch countless lives, that his church would become a symbol of faith-based social justice. As the sun set through the restored stained glass windows, casting intricate patterns of colored light across the stone floor, the church seemed to glow from within. The building hummed with quiet dignity and purpose. Its new chapter was being written, but it would never forget its secret past. Father Hollister's compassion still resonated within its walls, still inspired people to think about their obligations to one another, still challenged visitors to consider what they might do to help the vulnerable. Maria and James, who'd started with nothing, had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't gold or jewels, but the opportunity to be a guardian of history and a keeper of humanity's better impulses. The $1 church had given them far more than they'd ever imagined, not just a home, but a purpose, a community, a legacy, and a place in history. And through their dedication, they had ensured that Father Matthias Hollister's legacy of compassion would endure for generations to come.